The Civil War wasn't exactly a direct cause and effect ordeal. There were many events that ultimately culminated in the bloody conflict, some more important than others. Events that took place 70 years before the Civil War even started helped set the stage for it. So to get the full picture, you have to step back. Looking to devise a way to more efficiently remove the seeds from harvested cotton and also make some serious bank, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1794, and together with Phineas Miller created a manufacturing company. Planning to install their machines in cotton plantations across the South in exchange for a share of the profits, the duo was blindsided when their design was pirated and plantations went ahead and used it without them. Despite the fact that it was meant to make the process of harvesting cotton less labor-intensive, the invention of the cotton gin led to a dramatic increase in slavery in the South. With it, farmers could make more money and therefore grow more cotton and therefore acquire more slaves, in a really sucky positive feedback loop. This is one of the most disproportionately important events leading up to the Civil War. Without it, slavery wouldn't have been nearly as strong in the South. In the early 1800s, tensions between the pro-slavery South and anti-slavery North were on the rise, both in Congress and around the country. Admission of new states into the Union was an especially polarizing issue, since a new state's admission as a pro-slavery or anti-slavery state threatened to tip the congressional balance in favor of one of the factions. So when Missouri came a knocking, wanting some of that sweet, succulent statehood, Congress promptly exploded. Northerners argued that Congress had the power to determine whether Missouri could be a slave state, while Southerners argued that it should be up to them. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, Maine as a free one, splitting off from Massachusetts, therefore keeping the balance in the force, and any new states admitted north of the 36th parallel would have to be free, and any below could do whatever. And, like most compromises, everyone ended up hating it because nobody got exactly what they wanted. This was super important, as it was sort of a comforting but ultimately temporary band-aid on the divide between North and South. It prevented the conflict from escalating further and possibly igniting, a civil war. It also set the standard for future compromises regarding the admission of new states into the Union. William Lloyd Garrison was a leading abolitionist writer and activist. In 1830, he founded the Liberator newspaper, a highly influential paper through which he voiced his ideas. He also helped to better organize the abolitionist movement in New England, founding the New England Anti-Slavery Society, and a few years later, the American Anti-Slavery Society. Garrison's work was highly important, as he strengthened the abolitionist movement, allowing for better spread and advocacy of ideas. In 1831, Nat Turner, a Virginia slave, led the only sustained and effective slave rebellion in American history. Along with 6 fellow slaves, Turner killed his owners, secured arms, horses, and supplies, and subsequently recruited 75 more slaves to his insurrection. The makeshift platoon killed 51 whites and struck fear into slave owners across the South. Nat Turner, after evading capture for 6 weeks, was eventually caught and executed along with 16 of his followers. Nat Turner's rebellion was very significant, as it served as both the motivation and justification for harsher slave codes and tighter restrictions on slaves, and would deepen the divide between the North and South. In the 1820s, Texas was Mexican territory, and it was a sparsely populated wasteland. This allowed the Native Americans that lived there, like the Apache and Comanche, to do some serious damage to the newly independent Mexico, and they were in need of some kind of buffer. Their solution? American settlers following their manifest destiny. And so they brought in a crap load of settlers. Problems arose when, eventually, the American settlers outnumbered the Mexicans in Texas. In 1830, Mexico closed the border, banned the import of slaves, and imposed heavy taxes, which promptly pissed off the Texans, who declared independence, and both started shooting at each other. Eventually, the underdog won, and Santa Anna, dictator of Mexico, was forced to sign the Treaty of Velasco, recognizing them as an independent state. In 1836, the newly independent Texans selected war hero Sam Houston as their first president. and also voted to be annexed by the United States. Andrew Jackson and the Congress at the time kind of left them on red and didn't do anything, since the whole new state slave or not slave thing was kind of annoying to deal with. In 1844, Democrat James K. Polk was elected, having run on Texas-Oregon annexation, and in 1845, Congress finally annexed them as a slave state. The annexation of Texas was very important, as it not only directly led to the Mexican-American War, but caused even more tension between the pro- and anti-slavery factions in Congress. After America took young Texas under its wing, Mexico got understandably a little pissed off. In order to, quote-unquote, protect the new disputed border between Texas and Mexico, President Polk sent 3,500 men led by General and future President Zachary Taylor to the Rio Grande and kind of shoved them in Mexico's face. Mexico responded, as predicted, by attacking Taylor's men in May of 1846, and Congress promptly declared war. To make a long story short, American forces cut through Mexico like a hot knife through butter, and Santa Anna promptly resigned. In 1848, the new Mexican government and the U.S. signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which set the Rio Grande as the border, and also sold a bunch of territory, including California, to the United States for $15 million. The war was very important for many reasons. For one, America had, for the most part, acquired the entirety of the continental 48, and pushed all the way to the Pacific, finally reaching its manifest destiny. It also caused another flare-up in the pro-slavery/anti-slavery conflict, as the U.S. suddenly had a bunch of potential new states and had no idea what to do with them, and it led directly to the Compromise of 1850. The Wilmot Proviso was introduced by Congressman David Wilmot as a proposed amendment of the $2 million appropriations bill to negotiate the terms of the treaty that would end the Mexican-American War. If passed, it would prevent slavery in any newly acquired Mexican territory, should it be admitted as a state. Passing the House but failing in the Senate, persistent Wilmot tried to slip it in 2 more times before giving up in 1848. The proviso wasn't incredibly important on its own, but it did reflect what was going on at the time. The Democratic Party was split between its northern and southern members on slavery, and tensions were on the rise with no end in sight. That is, no end but war. Also, it helped to inspire the creation of the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party was a short-lived political party which opposed the expansion of slavery into the American West. Originally formed by Whig politicians who were angered by their party's neutral position on slavery, the party won 10% of the vote in the 1848 election, splitting the Democratic vote and leading to the election of Zachary Taylor. They would eventually be absorbed by the Republican Party. Though not incredibly important on its own, Taylor probably could have won without them splitting the vote. The Free Soil Party reflected the changing ideas and rising tensions that would eventually lead the country to split. A solution to the conflict surrounding the slave status of new states formed from newly acquired Mexican territory, the Compromise of 1850 was actually a buttload of smaller laws that were split up in order to pass. Orchestrated by the great compromisers Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun, who would all die within the next 2 years, it admitted California as a free state, created the territories of Utah and New Mexico, in which the question of slavery would be answered by popular sovereignty, banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and settled the Texas-New Mexico border dispute. It also contained the updated Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Slave Acts were a series of laws passed to aid the capture of runaway slaves in the North. The original act was passed in 1793 and was met with heavy criticism. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, passed due to the fact that the original was largely ignored by authorities, imposed much harsher restrictions and penalties for anyone aiding the escape of a slave. Problems arose due to the fact that since there was a financial incentive to recapture escaped slaves, some people would kidnap free black men and sell them to southern plantation owners. This is a massively important law, as it was a massive point of contention between abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates, and also the North and South in general. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published her massively influential novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was an instant success and sold over 300 copies in the first month. The book's abolitionist message helped fan the flames in the conflict leading up to the Civil War, and led many to support anti-slavery ideals. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a very important book at the time. It helped shape the public view of slavery going into the Civil War, and without public support, Lincoln wouldn't have gotten very far. The Ostend Manifesto was a letter sent between U.S. ambassadors suggesting that, should Spain refuse to sell Cuba to the United States, the U.S. should attempt to take it by force. It was the source of massive controversy at the time. In regards to American expansionism, the letter was very important, as it showed the extent to which the U.S. would go to expand its sphere of influence. In regards to the Civil War, however, it's not really that important. When the proposition of Kansas's admission in the Union brought on criticism from Southern senators due to the fact that its position above the 36th parallel would make it a free state, Stephen Douglas, thinking he was smart, introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Passing through Congress, the act repealed the Missouri Compromise line, it was a great idea, and admitted both Kansas and Nebraska as popular sovereignty states. Douglas screwed up, big time. The act would lead directly to Kansas's bloody internal civil war known as Bleeding Kansas, and in the end was ultimately ineffective because by the time it came into full effect, the Civil War had already started. The Kansas-Nebraska Act wasn't nearly as important as the Missouri Compromise or the Compromise of 1850, but it was still significant because, for one, it threw the Missouri Compromise out the window, which was just asking for conflict, and it led directly to Bleeding Kansas, as well as the disintegration of the Whig Party. Following the disintegration of their party, former anti-slavery Whigs held meetings with the objective of the creation of a new party. One meeting, held in Wisconsin on March 20th, is generally thought to be the founding of the Republican Party. This small event was incredibly important, as it not only marked the beginning of the party of Abraham Lincoln, whose election would play a big role in the South secession, and whose presidency would play a big role in the Civil War, but it marked the beginning of one of America's two most important and longest-lasting political parties. A direct result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas was a, bloody internal conflict within the state of Kansas, fought between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions over the question of popular sovereignty. When Kansas was admitted as a state whose status would be determined by popular sovereignty, pro-slavery advocates poured in over the border from Missouri, attempting to skew the vote. Conflict of interest led to armed skirmish and eventually resulted in the deaths of nearly 200 people. One notable leader among the free state fighters was the famous abolitionist John Brown, who orchestrated the Potawatomi Massacre, and who would go on to lead the raid on Harper's Ferry. On a national scale, Bleeding Kansas wasn't that important of an issue. There were bigger fish to fry at the time. But it helped fan the flames of national divide, and it was certainly important for the state of Kansas. Outraged by the events taking place during Bleeding Kansas, John Brown led a group of men, most of whom were his sons, and attacked multiple known pro-slavery settlers along the Potawatomi Creek. 5 died. As a result, John Brown's farm was attacked and his son Frederick was killed, but Brown himself escaped to Virginia. Though not very important on its own, the Potawatomi Massacre reflected the brutal nature of the conflict and how far people would go to fight for what they believed in, which set a very concerning precedent for the Civil War. Charles Sumner, an abolitionist senator, delivered a speech in May of 1856 decrying the violence in Kansas and blaming it on the South for trying to extend slavery forcefully, specifically calling out Senate colleague Andrew P. Butler of South Carolina. After his speech, Butler's cousin, Congressman Preston Brooks, promptly beat the ever-loving crap out of Sumner, who would take 3 years to recover. In and of itself, the attack on Sumner wasn't a very influential event, but it showed just how polarized and divided the country had become. Dred Scott was a slave who attempted to sue for his freedom on the basis of his residency in the free state of Illinois and the free territory of Wisconsin. The pro-slavery stacked Supreme Court ruled against him, and in the process, threw the Compromise of 1850 out the window by saying that slaveholders could take their slaves into Western territories and still own them. The Chief Justice, in his reasoning for the majority decision, stated that Scott, and for that matter any other slave, was not a person under the law, and therefore did enjoy the same rights. This Supreme Court decision was hugely important, as it massively inflamed tensions between North and South, and also completely threw out one of the most important antebellum compromises, leading the country that much closer to the war. The Lee-Compton Constitution was a proposed pro-slavery constitution for the new state of Kansas, whose ratification was rigged in an attempt to guarantee slavery in the new state. However, when it was sent to Congress for approval, it was promptly shot down, and Congress required that it be put up to a referendum. It would later fail. In the grand scale of things, the Compton Constitution wasn't incredibly important, however it did show that pro-slavery people would go pretty far to see their goals accomplished. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were a series of debates that occurred between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas in the Illinois state election campaign. Historians generally drool over these debates because the topics discussed were absolutely integral to issues of the day, and they touched upon deeper questions that influenced the political atmosphere. The debates themselves, and really the entire campaign, weren't very important in regards to the Civil War. However, they are looked back upon as important due to their pertinence to the political situation at the time. John Brown, after having fled Kansas in the midst of its internal troubles, also his farm being burned down, his son being shot, led an attempted raid in the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping that local slaves would join in and aid in the fight. Brown was wrong. He and his men were all either killed during the fight or executed later, and their eventual goal of a slave rebellion across the state, and I guess maybe the country later, was completely extinguished. However, the raid struck fear into the heart of slaveholders across the South, many of whom thought it was merely the precursor to many slave rebellions. As a result, tensions flared between North and South, as usual, and the South put in place extra measures to prevent slave revolts. In the messy presidential election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln and his Republican Party emerged victorious, having dispatched a divided Democratic Party. Many southern states had threatened secession if the Republicans won, and so before Lincoln was even inaugurated, 7 states had seceded. Essentially, they were fed up with the North's crap. Lincoln's election was very important as the final nail in the coffin of national unity, the final step in the long road to civil war. In the end, these events would result in the nation divided, and would lead into one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history, and the bloodiest fought on American soil. It was a dark and tumultuous period in American history, and though the Union emerged victorious and the country would eventually recover, there were countless lives lost. As well, the differences that led to the start of the conflict can still be felt to this day.